So now we've got the main event, Ashley, with his talk on Sails and React. So welcome, Ashley.
Hi guys, I'm gonna sit down. Wasn't my display came off just in time. So I'm planning to record this. Let's hope I have enough hard drive space, etc. Alright, so today we're sailing with Node and React. A little bit about me. I've been doing commercial work and web development since early 2009. I was mainly self-taught and I've historically just been a PHP backend developer. But before that in high school, I started off kind of doing web design and making things up and putting things on free domain names like co.nr, if anyone remembers that. But lately I've taken an interest in front-end development and trying to upskill in that area. Since this is a React meetup, I thought I might do a little bit of an introduction to react.js, now handling in the browser side of things instead of React Native, like James's talk last time. React is the view layer in an application, and you declare a render function in a class which declares what your DOM should look like. Which lets you see like a traditional template syntax for how things turn out when things change, like people click on things, AJAX requests get returned, etc. And then you can look at that render function and see how things might turn out in different situations, which, you know, it's kind of a far cry from the days of writing lists of jQuery functions in some other file that's nowhere near your HTML code. And it's quick because it will render just the smallest portion necessary in the browser. And it's ushering in a day where you're dropping support for some old browsers and you don't need jQuery anymore. So it's no longer cool to list jQuery on your skill sets.
Is that also the case with PHP?
Possibly. But with PHP 7 it's pretty fast, so it is also very popular. So here's an example of React component. This is called text input. And if I squidge down the bottom here, what this is doing is if you don't like the displays of HTML5 elements and their new fancy fields, which might let you do validators with native elements, you could write your own text input. And this is an example of one where if you blur out of a field, it instantly validates. And if I come back to that component, you notice a little onBlur handler here, and inside the input there's an onBlur which points to that. And what this kind of reveals, as I said before, is you see a template syntax that kind of shows you what might happen, rather than them being kind of disjoined and off in places. And calling that text input works a little bit like this. And so by doing this, suddenly every text input in your application feels nice, because when you skip out of it or you hit a button, it presents to you the validation error, or what you're supposed to do. So that's kind of introducing React to you if anyone doesn't know it. So how are we going sailing? with sails.js. The talk is to get you a concrete idea of what your first week will be like with Sails, and this will give you an opportunity if you're thinking of taking up Node.js. You might go and play with a competitor, which I'd suggest Loopback, which is kind of tied into an IBM hosting platform, which I think they'll be around for a while to help support. And my argument for Node here is that your backend devs need to learn JavaScript properly anyway, because the world we're living in calls for interactive front-end applications to be nice and pleasurable to your users. So why not have your front-end devs pitch in on the back-end too? Rails is a full-featured MVC. Sails.js is full-featured MVC framework, similar to that of the likes of Rails. It's Express-based, so if you know Node, you know that Express is pretty ubiquitous when it comes to Node apps. It's made up of middleware that's popular with Express, plus specific code from the Sails team, such as their ORM. And the core framework at the moment has 6,600 commits, 233 releases, 211 contributors since 2012, and 56,000 downloads last month. So it's pretty popular. It's quite up there in terms of stars on GitHub as far as JavaScript projects go, even though it's on the back end. So it does have official commercial support. The sales company, formerly called Boulder Dash. I'm not sure if the agency came first or the framework, but it seems like some guys got together and made an agency where you can just pay them to make your apps, and they wanted a framework in 2012. And the Node community probably wasn't quite too mature at that point. They will support tickets with 24-hour response times, $600 USD a month, a little bit on the pricey side, but for that you get the core developers, Mike and Scott there, who have done the most contributions. They're still part of the company, so and Mike's pretty active on the sales live chat, which is free. Just to give you a bit of an idea of project structure, in this .temp folder, your asset pipeline will pipe static assets into here. The API folder, this is the structure of your application, so controllers and models are pretty self-explanatory. Policies will sit between a request and your controller, so you can say, I check an ID, check the user ID, does exist, do you have permission, and put that in front of some automatically generated REST. We'll get to that in a bit. Responses, some functions live in here which kind of can look at your HTTP headers and decide whether or not to give you JSON or your template. Services, this is kind of like your domain logic where they're user service. So this is like, there might be things to find users, to save them, etc. in there. If you're keen on the kind of traditional MVC style of things. Assets, this is where it looks to pipe stuff into that temp folder. So supports less out of the box. So if you're doing a Bootstrap 3 website out of the box, you can import Bootstrap, change a few variables, and suddenly it doesn't look like Bootstrap anymore. Templates, these are I'm not hugely knowledgeable in terms of the JSD format, but this will be like, I think, templates for Angular and stuff like that, where it will push that automatically into your layouts for you. but we're a little bit ahead of the kind of Angular 1 days. Config, pretty self-explanatory. The environment folder lets you do overrides per environment. Node modules, this is where npm puts the file descriptor limit stress test. If anyone aware of Node, or I've done anything with JavaScript, we're using npm anyway. The JavaScript community likes a lot of small individualized libraries, kind of in the Unix kind of philosophy of do a small thing well, and so you can end up with hundreds of thousands of files in here if you're not careful, or if you've got 4 or 5 projects and you're deploying them onto a server. If you're copying the Node modules folder, it's going to take a while.
My project breaks that stress test.
Yeah.
I had to try and clone it or move it from one folder to another, and it said this file could not be moved because the file name is too long. It's just so far deep into dependency to the nth degree to one of the modules I'm actually using, so Windows won't let me move it.
Yeah. You shouldn't say that too loudly in here.
It's not like I have an option.
Yeah. Tasks. Command line tools for sales use grunt, which is kind of popular but a little bit old. So this config folder, it will interpret these folders so that you configure existing tasks, which you might install through npm, what have you, and register or make new ones. And there's some ones already in there, so you can modify the inbuilt ones, and so most of it just calls other tasks. Views, we don't need to touch too much of this on today, but Sails obviously has its own template format, which is EJS. I think that's embedded JS. So that's it in terms of the sales side. Is there any questions? All right.
So the templating language, you can't interchange other languages in Sails?
I imagine you could.
So you could put React backend in there? Or?
Yeah, I imagine you could. It is Express on top, so I'm sure you'd have some level of customization there. And at the very least, you have access to their responses, those response classes, which are probably handling that. So as you look around JavaScript in React land, you kind of have to get up to speed with ES6. And so I just thought I'd take you through some things that are a bit hard to infer from context. So almost everything you're afraid to ask about modern JavaScript. Let versus const. You'll see this a lot in code. My take on it is that people use both these, including let, a lot because you're saying I'm using an ES6 feature and I chose not to use const. So, so when you use let, you're saying this will be reinitialized or reassigned, whereas const can't be reassigned and is a constant. So the reason let gets used a lot over var, you said, well, this is ES6 and I chose not to use const. That's my take on it.
Another thing with let is that it doesn't get hoisted. Like
Okay, yeah.
var will get hoisted up.
Yeah. Arrow functions. You'll see this a lot. At the top there, we've got traditional function from ES5, and the this keyword is initialized. The reason that's important is if you write a component, you define a function in it, this won't actually refer to your component by default. So down the bottom there, you have an arrow function. So if you're triggering a call to something inside your component that React is kind of handling for you, this way, this kind of refers to your component instead of instead of the function.
So you don't need to, in the constructor, you don't need to say this dot function is equal to this dot function dot bind this.
Yeah. I do that in my code examples, but I don't think there's a wrong way between the two of them, because they do that in the Facebook documentation. But for certain things with event handlers and whatever else, it's kind of convenient, but in general, kind of just pick one and be consistent with it, I think. But yeah, this is a shorthand for that function as well, so you don't need the curly braces if it's on one line. You don't need the opening brackets if there's one parameter. And yes, that's skipping. Spread syntax. So you'll see this about the place. At the top here we have a function which just calls a console.log for every argument passed to the function. And then here we're defining an array. And here we're spreading that array out in order to put it into that array. Which you'll notice down here, I'm also using the spread syntax when I call the function. So this array then gets passed as separate arguments to that function. So you can see here that Baz and Dance are at the start. They'll loop through the arguments of the function and print them out one at a time. So those arrays get merged together. Promises. This one's not overly easy to infer by context. So promise is a way for handling the name callback hell, where when you're doing asynchronous operations, you might end up in a situation where 4 functions are kind of nested within each other. And promises tries to spread this out by once this hash password is asynchronous and it's returning a promise, once that resolves, and it may or may not pass a value, but in this case it's resolving with a value, so it's passed the user that's fetched out of the database or something like that, or that's changed its password in this case. And then here we're saving that user and returning a promise whilst that's saved to the database. This is not real in part of Sails, but just for argument's sake. And then once that resolves with the user that's been saved, in here it's being returned or passed to this function, and we do something with it. And you don't necessarily have to return a promise. If you're keen and you thought 2 bits of code that you don't want to have in if statements quite unrelated to each other, you could potentially return just the user object and they'll get passed to the next one in the line as well. As a general rule of thumb, don't go using this without also providing a catch, because your errors will get lost. It's not really executing those functions in this context as such. So catch an error, and I'm just accepting that error and calling done with it. And down the bottom here we have what's called Node.js style callback, where you call done when you're done, but you pass an error to it if an error exists. So this is kind of how you might mix and mash kind of asynchronous node functions and promises together. And that's it, I think. I don't know. And this is how you write a promise. So you've got create a new instance of a promise here. It's passed a handler, well, an event to call resolve, and one to reject. I'm calling some asynchronous code here with more traditional node asynchronous kind of layout. And if there's an error, well, I call reject. And I try again, and if if there's an error, I call reject. But if we make it to the end, we resolve with the value that we're trying to pass back. So this is how you convert some asynchronous code to promises. Any questions? Bearing in mind I may not know the answer. Sure.
So, you've written stuff that basically uses React with Sails?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so I didn't see that sort of happening there, so it wasn't. Is that the default sort of view layer for Sails, or?
We haven't quite got to the combination of the two yet. This is just showing some back-end Node.js code.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were saying that was the end of the talk.
Oh, no, just each section. Sorry, I've got 3 or 4 sections
Jumping
here.
gun.
Yeah, no worries. But yeah, in terms of the introduction to ES6.
I've got a good question. I don't have a large React. I don't write any production
Yeah.
code in it. But is Sails like the equivalent of the Angular CLI? If you know what that is?
I'm going to guess no. I don't know what that is, but that sounds like something to generate Angular components quickly.
Well, it generates the project, so it does
Yeah.
like the minification of everything. It does place everything in a known location. I looked at Sails today, and I was just trying to liken it to something.
Yeah, it's more of a traditional framework for server-side
Like
programming.
Rails.
Yeah, like doing Rails.
So it is
Yeah.
kind of, yeah, all right, thank you.
Cool. So let's get started setting up a project. This is how you would set up Sails, basically. So using that, I'll leave it up to you to install Node. It's pretty easy. Just Google your operating system plus install Node. Here, use npm to install Sails globally. That's the -G. So you can just, anytime you want to start a project, you can just go to Sails, new project name, change directory into that project. If you're rapidly prototyping, Sails can kind of just save your models to disk, and you don't have to worry about any schemas or anything. It will just kind of shepherd your models to do that. And Sails lift to start that process. So here's where we're getting tricky. Now, there is a project by someone, doesn't have a lot of commits lately, but they will generate a Sails and React project for you. If it happens to be working the day you try and install it, then great, but otherwise if you probably get looking a bit under the hood and why you need Webpack and to do React. So Webpack does a lot of things to static assets. In our case, we need JavaScript to come from ES6 and be ported down to ES5. And Webpack doesn't do that itself, but it uses Babel to transpile that. But Webpack kind of provides some of the sourcing of files to use JavaScript modules. It doesn't, if you just ran this with Babel, you couldn't import code, for example. You can only transpile that code. Need to install React and React DOM. This in here with the presets, you can define different presets for like what languages you want to support in transpiling down to ES5. env here will interpret a package.json file if you specified some browsers you want to support and decide what languages you need to support and what presets you need to install to do that. There's a preset for React, which is probably doing JSX, and Airbnb is a bit of a dependency for Enzyme, but it's probably just doing ES7, and so quite possibly you might not need it with this environment package. And I thought this was a cool little package that it's kind of the last step in, I think, providing async and await support. So you can turn those promises into synchronously looking code in your projects. Here's a configuration for Webpack. In this case, there's a bit of a wrapper around the top that we're working with the grunt config the Sails is interpreting, but after that it's pretty what you would expect from directly configuring Webpack. This stuff you can kind of copy and paste from various places, but something I've added is that the base directory of the project I'm putting into context, and this is so you can import files relative to the project directory instead of relative to that file. It's pushing in that Babel polyfill there for async and await support. So this will take an entry point that you defined and can grab all the code and push it into a bundle.js for you. Here we've defined those Babel loaders, which will define what JavaScript versions you want to support, which with that environment package will be pretty bleeding latest kind of JavaScript versions. Here we've got an inbuilt file that's already there. We're just adding this JSX to the exclusion. So I've chosen to end all my React components with a .jsx file extension, and I don't need those copied into the asset, the temp folder for me. And there's some tasks which need to call Webpack at the end to copy that bundle file. So sync assets, this is like it will detect file changes and run this again. And so without a lot of work, you kind of, I wouldn't call this hot reloading, but every time you make a change, it will rerun this and you'll get your fresh code. And this is just putting that bundle into the template and a container here to render a React component. And here's that component. So this is a pretty simple example. To get any simpler than this, you can define a React component as just a function rather than the class. But when you go to do testing, Enzyme has some features to search for things based on the class name. So generally speaking, I'd say you just use classes. So this is pretty simple. I think we can move on, but here's how that's actually rendering in the root element to see something on the screen. But you'd probably do like an app container and import it here, and that app container would then be the entry point for your application. So I've set up a public repo for the talk. The slides will be different, but the code and the package.json file with npm will be in this project, and you can click on this commit here to get up to that point in the presentation. Alright, we'll move on to the database side of things, but before I move on, was there any questions?
The example you've got on there, is that the Hello World?
That's up until that point, a working project with the Hello World. Alright, coming to the database side of things, we're swinging over to Sails now that we have a working React project. Install database adapter MySQL, .env. I don't know how popular this format is, but it's used in Laravel, so I picked it. Sadly, Sails doesn't have production-ready migrations. It's kind of a black magic thing where we'll, based on your models, create a schema for you straight away. won't have formalized migrations that you're comfortable running in production, so they say don't do that. But what I do is I point my test suite to a MySQL connection, and that database will be left there for me. It'll get destroyed at the start, but it'll be left there for me, and I can copy and paste create syntax into a migration file. But this db-migrate, it's popular, a generically popular migration package. .env is supported like with this package, and it takes a configuration file and puts environment variables into the node process. So rather than defining a database connection in two places, I'm doing it through this. Here I've got two connections, one for, and here's those environment variables, one for production and one for test. There's migrate safe here. I think that's saying, well, you don't need to automatically do migrations anymore because I'm taking care of that. It will ask you whether or not you want to do that. I won't just try that for you when you start Sails. There's a bootstrap file that you need to initialize the .env, and I don't know if you've seen the format before, but basically you set up .env.example without secrets in it, and then that gets committed to your repository, and so you copy that, the developers see that, they fill it in, and they copy it to .env. You exclude that from your project because you don't want production secrets in your repository. Moving on, try to be quick. This configuration for the migration library. This is what a migration looks like. There's an up and a down. I'm sure we've seen these before. I run those migrations with db-migrate up, and at this point I'd like to get started, so I can use Sails to generate an API for me. This will generate an empty controller, an empty model, and by default, once you've filled in that model, you will instantly have REST access to it. So if you were going down the path of React app that's saving and pulling stuff all out all the time to a lot of endpoints, I guess this will get you started pretty quick. But you'll just be mindful of security, that you're defining policies which check user IDs and IDs in your requests, and possibly even deleting out fields if you're going down this route. But you may end up just making controllers anyway, if that gets a bit too disconnected. So you want to check out some of the configurations for the Blackmagic stuff. I've left some links there. Here is a model. Has some attributes like first name, surname, password, min length, email. And these validations are returning a 400 error out of the box with the automatic REST routes that are dynamically available to you without turning them off. And you don't want to share a password. This toJSON function, that's what it's going to be called before it dumps things out of that REST endpoint, and so you don't want to be exposing things that shouldn't be exposed.
Is it possible to have an attribute of type object?
I'm not sure, but I reckon you could store a JSON field in something.
Is that correct to use the comps there, or are you deleting something else?
You can manipulate something that's assigned to the object, but you just can't reassign that const.
It's not freeze, like object.freeze will lock it. Const just means you can't assign it to another object, but you can modify that object. Set the fields.
And there's hooks, like before validation and before create. There's other ones. It's all pretty familiar to you if you've used an ORM before. But I would suggest to define try catches in here if there's any chance that an error is going to be thrown, because it's up to you to pass that error to the callback. There's no use running off a single process, so it's just going to be an uncaught error, which is unlike working with something like PHP. So we've got REST access to a user, and we didn't have to write anything. And I linked to the configuration file because there's extra black magic for developers. Just stop using that word, but out of the box you have this shortcuts bit where I can just type data into a URL to get some dummy data started. But you want to turn that off for production. So that's a little sales intro, and as before, you can view the commit to get up to this point.
And does Sales by default use Mongo?
I think you kind of choose your database. By default, I'd say it uses that disk thing generally, but you would have support for Mongo and other things. But yeah. Okay. Trying to inject a little bit of humour here. Wishing Adelaide is big enough for setting up testing with Enzyme and Mocha. I'm going to try to make the case that Adelaide is big enough for it, and so we'll see how it goes. So, why Adelaide is big enough? If you want to adopt some test-driven development philosophy around trying to write tests early as possible, rather than doing a lot of manual testing, the true philosophy is to write the test first and then your code to make those tests pass. So you make the test fail and then you make it pass while writing the code. But since we're working in a web browser and you're going to be doing things to make sure they look okay, I can forgive you for experimenting to get it to look right, and then you might want to break it down to reusable components and start writing code rather than manually testing all the specifics. This is a subjective opinion, but once you get used to it, I reckon you could achieve 70% of the velocity as you could of cowboying, stressed out without testing and without refactoring. And the flip side of it, if you go down that route, I would refer to that as 110% velocity, meaning your technical debt goes up and it gets harder and harder to work on the project over time. And so what started out as we don't have time to do something ends up in everyone being depressed and not doing as much as what they could have been doing. I suggest you talk to the business stakeholders involved and be brave. No one likes rebuilds. Entire projects before I've been rebuilt, I'm sure have taken years. I've been involved in one that's taken 13 months. It was probably a month away from being ready before it was pushed into production. And no one likes to hear Jeff built that and he's gone. And they also don't like to hear that whole section is a beast and I'll break something. So there is value here for the business stakeholders involved. Testing is good when you need to deploy frequently. So getting to the point where you're deploying every time a commit goes to master, that's probably just not sensible if you don't have continuous integration, thing like Jenkins, and you've got decent testing. You have more than one person in the team. The person working on it will change. Testing is good when a pleasant user experience provides business value to you. So if your clients are happy, then they might keep spending money on you. So that's my argument there, but it's up to us as developers to also get involved in the sales process, where if you're quoting $100,000 for a piece of software, there might be a separate section on there that costs $30,000 for the automated testing, and you can sell that as being, well, you might like to take over this project yourself one day, and you might like to deploy frequently and have us say yes more often instead of we can't do that in time because that's too big of a change. Testing is good when it encourages refactoring, and what I mean by this is that it does encourage refactoring, but the tests themselves, if they're written well and not bogged down too much in one area, that it will encourage refactoring. Like if they're written well, try to write them to encourage refactoring. Testing is good when you want to avoid rebuilds. Testing is good when you want to upgrade your environment or node version. So rather than being a situation where you avoid security upgrades or avoid major releases because who wants to go and test your entire app again, this way it encourages that kind of aggressive approach to the software being healthy and fast and secure. So diving in, setting it up, Mocha is our test runner. Babel register dynamically interprets, goes through your code to convert it into ES5, sorry. And Node does have an implementation of importing modules, so you don't need Webpack. So rather than using Webpack to generate a whole new test folder and then running the temporary folder, this will just go through and grab that code and transpile it down for you. But Node's got quite a bit of support for newer JavaScript versions, so this will become less and less relevant. Well, it will stay relevant because everyone wants to use the latest JavaScript version, but you won't have as many presets in Babel. Enzyme is the framework we're going to use for testing. That's written by Airbnb. JSDOM is the emulated DOM in which the tests run in, and React add-on test utils is kind of a dependency of Enzyme there. Cyan and Chai are very popular for Node.js testing, which just handle your mocks and stubs. In the case of Cyan and Chai, assertions and expectations. These are a couple of packages for mocking fetch. If you're using that in your React components to do Ajax instead of more traditional APIs, and I needed to install this local storage to support HTML local storage. Mute lets you temporarily turn off the console output in the things you're running. So when you're actually intentionally making errors, those errors don't end up in the code, in the test output. And barrels we're using for fixtures, and Supertest is doing a HTTP request to Sails in the case of controller tests. Now the setup file is a bit of a doozy. We've got that register for transpiling, setting up for local storage. This I'll explain a bit better. If you're using promises and you don't handle a rejection, you don't define a catch to catch the error, you can detect that event, and by default it won't have the stack trace in the output. So that'll probably change in the future, but I've written this here so that you see the stack trace. JSDOM. JSDOM changed 2 major versions in the past 2 or 3 months. So when I went to test this talk yesterday, I had to update this. Probably by the time you check the docs, the pull requests that I found will have been deployed. Down here, there's some things that JSDOM's not providing, or at least 2 versions ago when I was writing my code. So form data, that's part of your kind of JavaScript land in the browser that's getting passed to fetches, and local storage you would know. And down here we've got some setup code for Sails, and it's specifying that test connection, and it's dropping the database before it starts the tests. And under here is some loading the fixtures into your database. The database, it's kind of cool that your database is left there at the end, in my opinion, because you can copy, create syntax for your migrations, and you can kind of look at the data to see where things ended up if the test output's not too relevant. Because we've got that Babel register, we need to configure Babel. This node command you'll find in probably the Mocha documentation that I pasted it from. I've just added here node path equals print working directory, so that you can nest and organize your tests without having to do import statements relative from the test to somewhere in your project. It can just be from the root of your project to that React component. And here's what a test fixture looks like, and they'll get loaded into your users table. This is a test in Mocha. You can nest these describe calls to have pretty output in your tests. And this is a test. I haven't got a lot of setup code in here because I defined in my before each that setup, and then it will go on and run. I might want to modify that request in one particular situation, but it will go through and run the rest. And this is how you would test a React component. So I've used mount in this case. That will re-render the entire tree underneath that component, and if your code depends on something, in this case it depends on React Router, I've wrapped an instance of a router around it just so it doesn't break. Occasionally, when you're getting tricky, you might find something that's not in the JSDOM environment. In this case, I'm making something where you click on a link and it copies a URL, and that's where this exe command comes from, to copy something into your clipboard. So drilling in, I said by default contains a share URL. So I'm grabbing that wrapper, which is the enzyme mount, has created that object for us, and I'm looking for an import group. I'm converting it to HTML, and I'm saying I expect that to contain a URL, the same one that I defined in my React component at the top here. And you might set up a different scenario and say, well, it flashes success, it copies to the clipboard, and I would suggest the smaller you make these it statements, the more portable they will be when you do refactoring. And it's always handy to write methods that do work in the tests in order to make your tests small, because you need to kind of take a bit of TLC with your tests too, that they require maintenance, and so they need to be maintainable. Diving a little bit more into the theory of it, this is an example of an integration test. We're using mount again, and I'm doing very broad things with it. You know, I make a submit before I run these tests, and I check that there's an error. It's quite broad and high level, and this is an integration test or acceptance test. I'll call it integration because the way I'm going about it is just to lightly touch on all the integration points that you're doing things in here that call all the methods in this logging container, or touch on the properties that you're passing down. So down here I've got an interesting test here. Because this is after it's been submitted, and because the fetch call was asynchronous, happens on the next run through of the event loop. So I wrapped in a set timeout 0, and I'm expecting that form data, which is getting past the fetch, was called with the email and password data. So I'm checking that the request is well formed. And this is an example of a unit test where we're getting a lot more specific with things. And shallow is good here because it just renders that component and not all the children. So it's good for performance. I've written something where I'm including some JS library and it takes quite long to run the tests. And to avoid having to render or incorporate some child component, speeds up time. Here's another feature of Enzyme where I can search for a class of an instance. And here's mocking fetch again. This is sign-in, so this aspire will just tell you whether something's been called and what it's been called with. But it's less about defining behavior of what will be returned. It's just being created from nothing in this case, but you can use spy to modify methods and prototypes or anything that's available to you in this global space. Sales controllers and whatever else are in the global space, so you can just modify, spy on some method in a sales controller. And here, that's just restoring the mock of the fetch. That you have these hooks before and after tests, and you should clean up sometimes. So here again, we have small tests. Here we're checking state. So we're getting I call this unit test because we're getting very specific about what's actually happening rather than the end result. And I should speed this up a bit, but here we're checking the event handler has been called once and what it's been called with. This is part of React Router that I'm testing that I'm pushing a URL onto the stack history stack which will make you navigate to a new location. So after a successful submit, have I navigated to somewhere else? Upon an error, this is where testing comes really handy because it's hard to manually create errors. Have I set a danger error when something happens? Upon submit with 401 unauthorized, have I set a different blast message? With the 400 error, have I set a validation error message? So, to go a bit into my theory, my tips for testing is that you break down components into small reusable blocks and unit test them. Breaking down things into reusable blocks, that's coming from Facebook. But since they are small reusable blocks, you should unit test them because they might exist in different contexts and you don't want to be copying and pasting integration tests for every instance of those reusable blocks. The way in which I would break it down is thinking of it like your traditional view template. The page has a template, form has a template. But this is a front-end framework, so like I made that text input before, we're breaking things down just a little bit further, that when you need something interactive, that becomes its own repeatable thing. And Facebook likes this idea of having a container for Ajax above and shooting dumb presentation down into your lower components. So if I just look at something else, here's an example of a container where it's passing something dumb down into a page and it's doing fetch. And since I did say there was JWT in the talk, which has been left out, I'll just point out that the same origin there is so that your cookies are being set and sent on your fetch calls. cookies kind of being the most secure way to store your JWT tokens. But on a PhoneGap app or something, you'll probably end up using SQLite database or something else. But there's that. As I kind of said before, write integration tests that lightly touch on all the methods in that component and all the properties. You should write a unit test for that component that tests all the specifics of those methods. But you just kind of want to accept, yeah, these things are working together well. And if you write your unit test well for the reusable components, and you have a light integration test that is comprehensively testing all the elements, you'll get things pretty close to working. And before you say either my tests fail or the project does, my thought kind of on that is that if you're in a place like Facebook or Airbnb, you might be running tens of thousands of tests, and so that will take a very long time to run. But you're going to be like testing it before you commit and deploy anyway yourself. So why run a poor acceptance test twice, since you'll be doing that anyway. And I kind of said that before. Don't adopt testing without a continuous integration server. If you can't deploy to your environment without the test passing, then they'll stay passing because people will spend that 2 minutes to make a deployment happen. But if you have a stressful 3 weeks and everyone stops looking after their tests, those things won't be looked after, and months of good intentions will go out the window.
Can I mention something regarding tests? I find it's good to actually ensure that you try some tests that you know will fail, because if they start passing, then you know that you've written something that's just like return true no matter what.
Yeah.
For his emails,
Yeah.
those sorts of things.
And here we have getting to that commit at this point. Just checking that I made it to the bottom of all my sections here. So that's my talk. I got a little bit of time, so I might just demo some things I've made in React recently. Historically, kind of just writing rubbish jQuery things, it doesn't really incentivize you to make interactive things. This is a social post making thing. If I type all the words in there, the text shrinks. If it gets like to a point that's ridiculous, it gets even smaller. And here we've got some WYSIWYG things where it's manipulating these properties. And this all kind of looks pretty simple in the template because you just kind of see all the HTML in place and what properties get changed for what reasons with what properties. If you're making a WYSIWYG, I'm not calling this a true WYSIWYG editor, but you might avoid making this specific scenario because I can't get a WYSIWYG to do exactly what I wanted. I didn't actually want inline styles. I just wanted you to choose some basic things and show it for a live preview. And here I've let you attach an image, and it gets instantly previewed in the browser, and it's detected that it's a portrait image and put it on the left to make it look like the post that you're making. But if I attach a landscape image, it looks like the post you're making by putting it in the full screen. So that's, if I show that code and not the test, maybe not even, maybe not even the container. this probably needs to be broken down a little bit more, but in here things are affecting class names. You just see it all in one place. Down here, styles, font size are being manipulated based on properties passed through to from the container, and in a way this is quite understandable for a WYSIWYG editor and small and light. I just kind of hid the borders on a text editor and made something like this. And I think before React, I just wouldn't have thought in this way. I just would have looked up a WYSIWYG editor and spent days trying to get it to do what I wanted and not behave quite like the default settings. And I showed that before. I think that's enough for one day. Is there any questions? Yeah.
So it turns out my question's still valid, which was, is there any specific support for or interaction with React from Sails and vice versa, or is it pretty much just, it doesn't care, it's the view layer, I'm not doing anything other than you go and do the rendering?
There's no special integration, but it's nice that your test suite for both the back end and the front end runs together. The front end is very much its own application. I should show some test output here. This is kind of what tests look like by breaking down showing what's working. Looks quite nice. That's Sails running. If I run npm test, this is running the backend logic and the front end together. So you just quickly test that your entire application is working. And because I've wrapped the React components in little curly braces, you can tell which is React and which is Sails. If I go up the top, there'll be friends controller. So a human can read this. It's all running in one test suite. You can deploy a single application to an environment, and you're not sort of trying to come up with a statically built independent application for your front end, deploying that somewhere, and then deploying your PHP backend or whatever somewhere else. It's all just a single application. The test suite runs quickly for both, and yeah, it's just cool. There's both in JavaScript. So you learn JavaScript well, and it applies to front end and back end. Everyone kind of has to learn JavaScript now, anyway. So, do you have a question?
Yeah, no, I was just saying, so have you built like a large kind of application with Sails, or are you still just kind of playing around with it?
I've built this.
Yep.
So it does some things. I might, since we've got a little bit of time, I might show. Might show some Sails controllers.
You mentioned Loopback. Have you used Loopback?
No, I just think coming across researching it, Sails and Loopback were kind of suggested in a similar vein or similar rooms. Just looked at the docs a little bit, but it's, I guess, handy that IBM's tied to it in terms of long-term support. So here's an example of some controller code in Sails. I'm using promises to go through my models, detecting a validation error here, encrypting, making a JWT token and returning it in the JSON response. So yeah, uses passport. So the talk did end up with JWT in it. So Passport's doing the authentication for me, and we'll show a little hook. That should be an is authorized or is authenticated. Using Passport to get the JWT token from the requests, and just, you know, if it's successful, it binds the user to the request. So because this is JavaScript, nothing's set in stone. So you can manipulate the request object to, you know, pull things out, attach to them. Wouldn't do it too often, but it's pretty common that you want your user. So that's something that would be in docs and stuff as well. Let's do it that way.
If you've got something that you need to apply, you know, across a large number of requests or the whole application, like, you know, working out is the person authenticated and therefore do you need to redirect them? Is there a sort of Sails specific way of doing that, or would you use like Express middleware, or?
This is probably pretty familiar with Express things, I think, where you only make it onto the controller if all of these policies call next. I
So
believe.
policies are basically the section of your project structure where you're putting in rules like that.
Yeah.
Yep.
And do they all just chain together?
I believe, yeah, they're just called one after the other, and if it doesn't make it to the end, it doesn't make it to your controller.
So can you do other things then that are not necessarily, you know, a gateway, but just something that you want to do on every request, like logging that a request has happened and things like that? Is that the sort of place for those?
I would suggest you can do that. There might be another place to log every request, but yeah, I would do other things with it. I would write another policy here which looks for ID and user ID in requests, so that those REST routes, those automated REST routes, aren't letting anyone modify any field, and you will probably be deleting fields in there that in the request that you don't want user to be able to modify. Cool. So I believe we have a couple of people to say something at the end.
Yeah, well, thank you, Ashley.